Hey everybody, this is Rydo, and we're back to Dear Esther Landmark Edition. So, we played through the game, not very impactful story, and that's pretty much all this game has is a walking simulator. Everything else pretty much has to be dismissed as far as visuals and audio, since that's just been bought from the Unity Asset Store. But we want to try the director's commentary, which has a chance of being something more. I checked the achievements, and for the ones I've missed, I didn't trigger one of 34 voiceover points in the main game, which is just the absolute worst case scenario, is that we'd have to run around the entire level trying to do that. There's also apparently 4 urns, and I found none of them. And then there are 59 director's commentary, of which 0 obviously have been triggered. I'm hoping the director's commentary are much more like the Left 4 Dead director's commentary, in which there's some visual item floating around that I have to walk into to trigger, other than just walking around to trigger things. These urns obviously must be difficult, so I'm hoping the director's commentary points me both to the urns and the one dialogue. But this is going to take a while, so let's just hop in here. The fact that there's 59 director's commentaries and 34 voiceovers in the game does imply that the creator of the game, which I hope is the actual director giving the commentary, has gotten more opinionated and wordy.
Hello everyone, I'm Dan Pinchbeck, I'm the creative director of the Chinese Room, and this is the Dear Esther developers commentary.
Hi, I'm Robert Briscoe, I'm the artist on Dear Esther.
And I'm Jessica Curry, and I was the composer on the game.
So what you're looking at today is a remake of a mod. Dear Esther started off in 2007 as a Half-Life 2 mod that did really well in the modding community, which was fantastic, and as a result of that attracted the attention of Rob, who worked as the primary developer on a Source remake of the game that was released in 2012. And this year is another remake where it's been updated for a cross-platform release, and we wanted to add in this developer's commentary just to give you a bit more of an insight into some of the ideas behind the game as it came together.
So, interestingly, I guess the original mod, then being in the Source engine and not the Unity engine, would have looked fairly different. Unfortunately, with the Source engine is just not a great engine to make too much around, other than Valve meddling with it and making the Half-Life game series and Call of Duty. Nobody else really uses it to any level of success. And they are struggling, Valve is, to, does that say food and goods? They are struggling to make Source Engine 2 actually succeed. It would make a lot of sense for Valve to perhaps more open source their Source Engine and let somebody else take the reins of it. The Source Engine is mostly built around the idea of physics and having gravity guns and things like that, which would play really no role in this game. Now, we do know that there's some level of randomization here, and I feel like this book was different originally, the first time we played.
So you'll see around you in a lot of the environments, there's a lot of detail ingrained into everything. One of the things that I wanted to do with Dear Esther is bring the visuals up to the same kind of level of detail that Dan and Jess had put into the other areas of the game. So all of the history and the kind of hidden pieces of story that intertwined with the VOs and the music and stuff, I kind of wanted to bring some of that into the environments. So if you look around you, you'll see that there's a lot of interesting bits and pieces, a piece of paper with someone's name on it, a photograph, an ultrasound. All of these little bits and pieces are kind of laid in to just kind of bring another aspect of the story into the game. And also, they're actually randomized, so every time you play, you'll see something different lying around. And this is just to build on this idea that everybody has a unique experience and a unique interpretation of the story.
So this seems the same. Notice he did mention an ultrasound there, so there is a baby aspect in the story that you can have. Now, the problem here for me is I'm looking at this monitor, this TV, 8 feet away. So I can't really read what that says from this distance. This really isn't a console laid back experience. And it definitely, to me, feels like there's a case here where the original creators of the mod are just not really involved at all in this remake of a remake.
So you'll see around you in a lot of the environments, there's
and
a
you just
lot of
trigger
detail
these
ingrained into everything.
no matter what. And I don't think there's
one
a way
of the
to
things that I wanted to do
stop
with
it.
Dear Esther is bring the visuals up to the same kind of level of detail that Dan and
So
Jess had put into
They
the other
probably
areas of the
planned
game.
for you
So,
to walk through here, turn
all of the
around and walk
history
through it
and the
while
kind
you're
of
still talking.
hidden pieces of story that are intertwined with the VOs and the music and stuff, I kind of wanted to bring some of that into the environments. So if you look around you, you'll see that there's a lot of interesting bits and pieces, a piece of paper with someone's name on it, a photograph, an ultrasound. All of these little bits and pieces are kind of laid in to just kind of bring another aspect of the story into the game. And also, they're actually randomized, so every time you play, you'll see something different lying around. And this is just to build on this idea that everybody has a unique experience and a unique interpretation of the story.
Now on the achievements, I don't know if you actually need to trigger all the achievements in one playthrough as far as the voice over parts. So we'll take the low road this time.
Part of the point about the whole game, I think, was this idea that rather than having a linear, straight-through version of the story, that we could have multiple story units for each place you were. And I was really interested in this idea of how you can open up that space that people can interpret. So I loved the idea that you could have two people that had played this game and then would have a conversation about it, and one of them would say, oh, what did you think about when this happened? And the other person would be like, well, that didn't happen for me. I had a completely different event happen or a completely different story happen. And it kind of feels very gamey in that way, that actually one of the things I love about writing for games is that you hand over so much control to the player that it becomes their story, and that's really, really important rather than trying to force them. So using randomised blocks of voiceover in the game and the kind of randomised prop details that Rob was talking about means that it gives it a really different feeling every time you go through. And that's kind of interesting for me, because I like the idea of going, well, not everyone has to have the same experience, and because it's interactive, you have the capacity to have very different experiences occupying the same space. So yeah, but balancing all that then becomes an absolute nightmare.
I think it's nice though, because everybody gets a personal experience. Like I love reading the forums and seeing how people come.
I don't know how you could have walked slow enough to
tell their story,
have that dialogue
and what they interpreted of it, and then you see other people discussing
dialogue.
what they thought of it. And to me, it's kind of nice because everybody takes something unique away from it.
And it doesn't seem to me like the audio of the main game is playing now.
When I wrote the music for the mod of
We'll
Dear
walk
Esther,
really
there was
slow
absolutely
towards the next
no budget
spot.
whatsoever for live players, so all the music was sampled. But one of the good things about that is it actually forced me to be quite creative about how I wrote the music. So with my background in sound art, I wanted to use samples in a different way that wasn't just using it to sound like a violin. I wanted to time stretch and manipulate samples to make something different and strange and quite unique. But then when we got the Indie Fund money, I had the amazing opportunity to re-record the music with live players. And that was so exciting for me, actually, because that's where it comes to life. And I thought long and hard about whether to write new music, going from the mod to the commercial version. But actually, I decided that my initial and original emotional response to the game was probably going to be the strongest response and reaction that I had. So I just literally, the music that I'd written for samples, I then wrote out for live instruments. But what they bring to it is transformative, actually. And I think The Beach is a really good example of this, where, you know, you have these awful samples soaring away, and then you have the string quartet playing this very bleak, very sparse music, and they bring the presence of the island immediately to it, and it comes to life. And that's the exciting thing about it. It wasn't a huge budget, but just having that experience of working with the players was just magical.
So yeah, I had to walk just as slow as possible for that to play out completely. And the phrase creator's commentary probably should be used instead of director's commentary. Or since it just doesn't really feel like you're exclusively doing creator's comment, doing one director's opinion here. Yeah, I could see going through this and still not finding any of the errors. I could see going through this and not triggering any of the audio responses. I really doubt how much different the
Everything
story
about
would
Esther for me is a dream. The landscape is not an island, it's the dream of an island. The music is like music that you wake up because you've heard in your sleep, but you're not conscious of hearing it. And the language in the story was supposed to be like that as well. It didn't matter the sense it made, it was more about the kind of the shapes it created, if that makes sense. So that the words would kind of were like being in water, like listening to something underwater. It'd be this very dreamlike, symbolic, poetic thing. And it always had frustrated me in games with game writing. This has really changed quite a lot. There was never any space for poetic language. It was very exposition-y, very descriptive, very direct. And you'd have like art and audio would have these amazing creative spaces they could explore. But when it came down to actually writing, you just had to basically go into the room, describe the character, tell the player what to do. And it just seemed like the most boring thing you could do with words in a game. And why couldn't a writer have the same artistic freedom as a visual artist or an audio designer or a musician, in terms of being able to say, isn't this just about creating this kind of emotional tone, this emotional space? And it's really, I still love that about the game, and it's one of the things I love so much about Nigel's voiceover, is it has this really odd, disconnected, kind of dreamlike quality to it, where you might finish the game and not actually understand anything that happened, but you're being carried along in the flow of it. And without any kind of sarcasm at all, I get into trouble saying things like this. The same design principle applies as this to Halo. It's 30 seconds of fun, or 30 seconds of depressing engagement, I guess, in our case. But it is about that loop of being in the moment in the game constantly, and that's actually the critical thing that matters.
So, there's the voice of the nonsense as far as the bad writing there. And I just have to say, without hitting every single point of what was just said, I disagree with pretty much all of it. Here we have a depiction of a shell and that seems to end in a diode depiction, or this could be mathematical depictions of geometry and ratios of geometry. The truth of the matter is, gamers have just been trained to expect for the story to be fairly straightforward and not subtle and artistic and not sound like the mumbled sounds you might hear underwater. And so that's just what's expected, and that's just what you have to do. In the same way that if I order a cake, I expect it to be a cake. If I order a steak, I expect it to be a steak. You can't be a high art chef and go to a restaurant and order a cake and then be served a slab of beef. And you can't order a slab of beef and be served a pile of sugar, flour, and eggs and water. It does feel like maybe you would have a fairly different experience on the second playthrough, but even in this director's commentary, I'm not being encouraged to play the game a second time to get that different story. And so then it creates this weird situation where theoretically, to get all the achievements, you're probably going to have to either have a walkthrough or play the game 3 times just to hear all the director's commentary.
This symbol on the beach, which is the golden ratio, is
That's
one of the only things that's really left explicitly from the mod. In the original mod, there was an awful lot of more kind of symbols and kind of a much more kind of mystical, sort of magical element to the island. There was a lot of very weird stuff in there. And a lot of them came out of the commercial version because they felt like they were a little bit explicit. I mean, instead, there's a lot more hidden kind of codes and symbols in there. There's still some stuff which you can only actually see or experience if you are not playing the game, if you're looking at it from editor. We had in the original mods things like trees planted to mirror the shape of the M5, or there's a whole bunch of things that are there to represent star clusters and all kinds of things like that. And we'll probably talk a bit more about kind of like hidden details and the secrets in the game as we go through. But that was really interesting for us in terms of the design of it, of going, you've got your kind of your conscious, explicit play experience, but games are always constantly manipulating your mood and your feelings and the decisions you're making. And so really trying to create a space that had all of these kind of subliminals in it was a really interesting thing that we wanted to do, both with the original, and then I think it got lifted up into a much more sophisticated version when we went to the commercial, because Rob was able to bring that sort of level of artistry to the visuals that really got that kind of sense of hidden meaning in there. And that was really important, given how kind of complex and symbol heavy and poetic the story is, where a lot of it doesn't actually make any sense, but it's about kind of leaving you with these, I guess, like the half-life of ideas and thoughts that you can't quite shake, that stay with you. So we really were trying to get that blend of how music, story and visuals could all create that really sort of uncanny structure that you wouldn't necessarily be able to define properly, but you knew it kind of had a meaning that was staying with you.
Now, when he says half-life of ideas, I assume he's talking about Half-Life as in radioactive Half-Life and not Half-Life the video game. Weirdly, this seems like this is
taking
taking
I wanted to
this
do as an artist
to a completely different location.
Create, some kind of reward for the player when they explore the island. There are some areas of the game where it's a little bit more quieter. There's no music or there's no voiceovers. So I kind of wanted to create a bit of an incentive for people to explore. And you'll find around the island that these kind of like random scattered items that are usually slightly out of place from the environment themselves, but in another aspect they actually bring a little bit of story to the island itself, usually to the island or to the actual protagonists or the characters that surround it. So you'll find that around the island these little props and stuff. Just keep your eye out for it if you're exploring.
I do think the original probably was a little bit better, and it is kind of crazy to make such a drastic difference between the original mod and the commercial version, but had the game initially shown that it was going off the deep end and that you were going to see just a lot of mystical, magical nonsense symbols, then I would have been more prepared for the ending, whereas the ending as it's depicted right now, or the ending at least that I experienced, is not particularly well connected to what the rest of the story starts off with. The beginning of the story is fairly grounded in makes a decent amount of sense. It's not until you get into that fourth chapter that things start to get crazy. And almost certainly that dead-end cave is where the one dialogue in the main game was that I missed. And so I'd have to reset the game and play that,
people have asked
which
why
isn't too much work.
Dear Esther's set on a Hebridean island. What's really interesting about this is it's one of those times when your kind of aspirations as an artist and the practical realities kind of dovetail. We knew that we had to have some way of limiting the player from disappearing off the play space, and when we made the original, it was a mod, and because it was a Half-Life 2 mod, you kind of had Eastern European city, spaceship, or blasted, desolate landscape, were your three options if you didn't want to start making any other assets. So it started off with these practical constraints. We don't want to set it on a spaceship, we don't want to set it in an Eastern European city, so it's got to be on this kind of like this desolate landscape. And we want to limit the player, so an island seems like a natural choice. And it's really interesting how you start from that, and we had this big lump of clay on a table that we were carving out paths and things to annoying the cleaners and things like that. And Jess and I were talking, and Jess started making sort of snippets of music to kind of go in there. And then all of a sudden we just went, oh, that's the story. Oh, that's what happened here. But it really started, I think, from the place. And when we started looking at photographs of Bore, we started going and reading some of the history behind it. Suddenly that was it. And it just was really, really naturally became, this is the place, this is what happened here, this is how it feels. And then everything else kind of coalesced around that.
Yeah, I think as an artist it made my job a lot easier because those islands are so kind of like the environment is kind of hostile. You're out there in the Hebrides. You've got this kind of like inclement weather. You've got cold, rain, snow. It's a very kind of it can be a very depressing place to be at times, but it's also at the same time very beautiful, and it's this kind of like stark, bare landscape, but has this beautiful surroundings. So it's, in terms of art, I think it really helped me to portray a lot of the themes in Dear Esther.
And there was a natural fit with the music as well. It suggested a musical style, which was really key, I think.
Well, that ended fairly abruptly. Weirdly, there is no commentary here in this cave. Yeah, and they just drone on, so you really are going to have to just stop and listen to the commentary. The pathways are also fairly narrow, so there's a decent chance that you would accidentally... Whoops. Still can't really make it up there. There's a decent chance that you would accidentally walk over a commentary and start it again just because the pathway is narrow. So far everything seems fairly similar, and if anything the low road really just proves to be a side area. I assume there's exactly one urn in every level, but particularly in the beachside beginning chapter and the last chapter, there's a decent chance that the urn is just behind a rock in the water that you'd have to swim around to find. So my hope here is that there.
So people have asked why the
I touched it
Dear
without
Esther's
trying.
set on a Hebridean island. What's really interesting about
Is
this
there
is
an
one of those
exit
times
button?
when your kind of aspirations as an
Nope.
artist and the
None of
practical
the buttons do
realities kind of
anything.
dovetail. We knew that we had to have some way of limiting the
It's
player
kinda
from
crazy that
disappearing off the play space. And when we made the original, it
as
was a
a
mod, because it was a
source
Half-Life 2 mod,
engine,
you kind of had Eastern European city,
you
spaceship,
don't
or
have a button
blasted, desolate
at least
landscape. You had
cancel
three
the
options if you didn't
document
want to start making any other assets.
commentary, the
So
director's
it
commentary.
started off with these practical constraints. We don't want to set it on a spaceship. We don't want to set
Let's
it in an
just
Eastern European
assume
city. So it's
that
got to be
this
on
will
this kind of
start
like this desolate
New
landscape.
text here when
And we
we
want to
touch
limit
it.
the player. So
One of the things you're always trying to do as a composer is create memorable themes. And a slight confession is that probably the most memorable theme, which is Remember in Dear Esther, wasn't actually created for the game. Rob's
I'm-
looking shocked. So it was actually from a piece of choral music that I'd written years before, based on a Christina Rossetti poem called Remember. And one of the things I was talking about earlier was how I didn't have any budget. So I had this piece of choral music, and I thought, hang on, this is absolutely perfect for Esther. But I don't want to use all of it. So the only bit that you actually get in the game is the first line of the choral piece of music. But that actually went on to form the main theme of the music that I wrote. And I think for me it's really interesting about how things that you've written earlier, years before, sometimes come in really, really useful and fit. So I always tell people and students not to despair if something doesn't get used or doesn't work at the time, because actually there'll come a place or in a time where you think, hang on a minute, I've got something that fits. So in terms of that memorable theme, the Remember theme gets used in multitude of different ways during the game. And one of the things it does is helps you to identify the kind of psychic place that you're in the game. So the theme is played in lots of different ways, and actually you'll notice that as you go through the game, it becomes more and more broken and more manipulated and broken down as the player goes through the journey and as you're psychologically struggling to get to the end point in the game. So music's really, really useful for highlighting the psychological mood, and we talk a lot about psychogeography, which always sounds a bit pretentious, but actually I think it's really important to what the three of us did in the game.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dan, maybe you want to talk a bit about that.
Like the core kind of idea about psychogeography, if you're not in the place you're in is not the place you're in, or you create the place you're in. It's not just as you're here and then the landscape's out there, but you don't navigate like a city by street signs and by those kind of formal things. You navigate it by the things which are significant to you in the way that you've lived in that space. And I think that was really kind of key to, I think it's really central to how the fusion of art and story and music come together in Dear Esther, because it's not a place where we're going, right, we have to lead the player up here because it's a natural formation, and then you would naturally have a piece of music here because you come around the corner. But the story, music and art all work around the idea of what's going on in the narrator's head at this point. How do we represent his emotional state relative to this landscape? And again, it's that idea of the game is, it's a dream of a place. It's like the idea of it being a fever dream or a coma dream, which obviously ties in a lot with the kind of story, and we'll come back to in a lot more detail when we get to the caves a bit later on.
This commentary is still very long. So, at a certain level, this almost is a game that invites comparison to something like Psychonauts, where you psychically go into the brain of certain people, and then there's entire 3D platforming elements based on the mentality of that person's brain. But I honestly didn't feel much of that, if I felt any of that. I never really felt like I was getting an insight as far as to what was happening in the brain of the narrator, since I didn't even really know who the narrator was in the first place. Yeah. Let's just start the next commentary.
White Lines.
Yeah.
They actually did this. It was really cool. I found this historical document. They used to do this on Boré and the Hebrides. If their disease broke out,
Really?
they'd actually chip out and expose the chalk. So if you're on a boat and you were coming to the island, you know not to land because it was infectious, which is the coolest, most amazing. It's one of those things where you go, it's almost impossible as a writer to come up with something as cool as that. It just has to be something that was actually done. And it's so sad as well. And I love this bit and the fact that we can do it, because it feels really real, because it references a real thing. And I don't know, there's something really special about that. But it was always one of those bits in the game that I thought, we've got to be able to represent this somehow. We have to be able to get these things in here.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I actually didn't know that was actually based historically in real life, but that's really cool. Because I mean, my thing about the White Lines is that it was this completely surreal thing, but also it was kind of it just added to the landscape. It's like, whoa, what the hell is that? And putting that into the game was kind of challenging, because to me it just seemed like, oh, it's going to be really hard to pull off. In a way that's kind of realistic, but then when you look at the kind of art style of the game, it's not really a realistic thing. Like everything is half imagined. So in that way, it kind of really fit into the landscape, and it kind of creates this amazing sort of landmark that you see in the environment. And I just found it really interesting to hear about that. You know.
I think it's one of those things where it's not a realistic place. And I mean, no game is a realistic place anyway, but one of those things where understanding that you're making something which isn't real and you have that kind of capacity to be sort of, to explore it artistically. And we'll come back and talk about sort of like it not being realistic, I think, in a little while. But that's really, really important, because then you can say it's about what these things kind of represent or how they make you feel as a player, not about going, is this accurate? And I get really inspired by sort of doing a lot of research into kind of history and things like that with all of our games, because you can just find those things that just kind of like speak to you. But it's amazing you can find that in like an 18th century book and go, that really speaks to me now, that has meaning now, and that's fascinating, I think.
Yeah, I think you run into a huge problem when even the creators of the game themselves are not communicating with each other, and even they don't feel like the white lines aspect was realistic and was something that really happened. I personally did not feel like it was really something that had happened either. It definitely, to me, felt like it was made up, or that it may have happened somewhere and been exaggerated. I wonder if the urn is just at the top of this mountain. I'm really hoping that the director's commentary tells me where the urn is. Nothing really changes though in the second walkthrough. That like you can't really experience the game a second time. I also have to throw this out, and I don't want to come off too rude on this, but this definitely feels like this is a UK-based game company that potentially has only 3 to maybe 20 people actually working on the game, and for a Half-Life 2 mod, one person working on it's fine, but once you got to that commercial release, probably should have been a little bit more people. There probably should have been a little bit more experienced people who would have had some more input, and there definitely should have been a lot more communication, so it was more of a remake of a general concept from a new creative direction and a new group of creative inputs. This
Something that I
weirdly
wanted to bring through in
seems
the
like
art of
they're
the game
just
was the same kind of fidelity that you find in the both Jessica's music and Dan's writing. In the same kind of way that you have all of these little details, these very close attentions to detail that kind of really bring richness to the story. And something that was missing in the original mod version was just this lack of a visual layer of story. And something that I did throughout the art of the game is to add in all these little details here and there, little bits of story, little links to certain things that you may or may not hear or see, just a layer of richness in the world, and give you some kind of reward for exploring. So keep your eye out as you look around.
Right, so that was a shorter one. I guess maybe the idea is that these white patches are supposed to eventually evolve into the writing on the sides of the wall in the last chapter. But I don't think they do a great job there. You'd have to have a fairly longer game to get you comfortable with how the island is supposed to look, and then slowly evolve the island so it changes just a little bit here and a little bit there. There are definitely some sound effects that just play at random that sound like I'm just hearing noises outside my house instead. Maybe I am.
There's a scene in Donnie Darko where Drew Barrymore's playing his English teacher, and she talks about Celador as being the most beautiful word in the English language, and about it's the sound of the words together. And Dear Esther actually comes from the introduction to From a Faith No More song, the Crab song on the first album, Introduce Yourself. And there's a point where I think think it's Chuck at that point as the vocalist before Mike Patton, just says, "Dear Esther." And it really lodged with me because the sound "Dear Esther" just has a really amazing sound to it. And I think when we started making it, and the idea of it being this series of letters to someone came through, it just came straight back out of going, that's just a really beautiful sounding combination of words. And I think that really sums up the whole approach to the writing in Dear Esther of what's the most beautiful combination of words and images we can put together, and to do it that way rather than writing a traditional plot as such. So yeah, Dear Esther, Faith No More and Doom, that's where it comes from.
Yeah, this guy sounds like he's done a little too much drugs. He definitely feels like he's got that UK British punk aspect going on. Yeah. It's almost like a turtle. Yeah, there's really no telling where the urns would be. I'd almost need a walkthrough. And I assume you can find them in the director's commentary version.
I think the central question to
the
the entire experience, for most people that have played it or are talking about it, is this idea of, is the island real? Is what's going on a literal event of a man walking across a Scottish island, or is it a dream that he's had? Does the island even exist? And one of the things that we try to do with the writing is to constantly lull the player into a position where they got an understanding, they made a decision about what they thought was going on, and then to undercut it. So you never actually were able to settle on any one interpretation. And that was the challenge I set myself when I wrote the original mod, was can we put a story in a game that not only lends itself to multiple interpretations, but there is no stable interpretation. Every single interpretation you have will always have questions, and you'll never be able to fully trust what you think you understand about the game. So it's challenging, I think, for that result. And it becomes quite a challenging kind of game story because of that, because you don't ever get that situation to go, I understand it now, I can walk away from this thing and it's all closed off and it's tidy. It was a very deliberate attempt to say, no matter where you think you are with this story, you're always questioning whether or not that's right.
Problem with that idea of writing a story which has no stable foundation ever revealed to it is that you then have a very weak story that doesn't mean anything. And that's 100% what I feel like has happened here, is that they've written a fairly weak story that can roughly be squeezed into a few different interpretations, but none of which matter any more than the others. The truth of a story is the thing that we often are seeking out when playing any kind of narrative. And there is just no truth when you write a story that way. There's no artistic truth coming out from the writer, who seems to be more poetic than is good for a video game writer to be, and uninterested, and doesn't really have a truth to speak to as far as telling this narrative. It would have been better, even if it was false, for him to say this was based on a true story of something that was inspired by true events or something like that. So then people would give it more credence. He probably should have been.
One of the things that's been most commented on with the audio and
events.
The music in Dear Esther is how sparse it is. And that was a really deliberate tactic. I wanted to leave room for the player to think and to dream and to wonder and to put their own interpretation into what was happening. And I think the problem with so much modern media is how bombarded we are constantly. It's the kind of MTV, flash in your face, constant music. And Dan and I watch a lot of drama together, and it really is constant
Endless,
music.
which is constantly telling you what you should feel, like really clearly, and it's like being kind of beaten up by the music sometimes.
And when you read a lot of reviews of Dear Esther, a lot of people say they had this time to think and to interpret, and that was one of their favourite things, that they placed themselves so directly into the game, and it's their experience. And I think that's actually the greatest success of the game on all points, from the story to Rob's art to the music, is we all left space for the player to dream.
So I'd say, first of all, you shouldn't probably comment on criticisms or reviews in a director's commentary in the first place. It's not going to lead to anything other than you, as the commentator, sounding petty or sounding butthurt or whatever phrase you want to really use to imply that you're maybe a little inconfident. Okay, so I would assume this is an urn. So the problem with Steam achievements, though, is that to find whether you've gotten the achievement or not takes a while. It doesn't always immediately pop up, and it doesn't always pop up each individual time. Now, I will applaud the musician lady in saying that she does actually do a fairly good job of having falling action and growing action. This feels different. This is all just ever so slightly different. So, like, the first time I saw this, I saw a Bible, and I saw a bunch of Bible quotes. Now it seems like we're seeing a chemistry book, so we probably will see a bunch of chemistry notes. But the thing I think that they get wrong here, since this is at best a 2-hour game, is they really did need to, with the audio, try and tug at the heartstrings and create as big of an emotional reaction and connection to the game as you could possibly do it. And there really isn't a lot of room for falling action as far as just having completely silent music. And then when you do have rising action, when the music plays, it really is only playing 2 or 3 stanzas for maybe 30 seconds or so, and then it stops to be a little quieter again. And maybe you could pick up some of the slack with more sound effects, but I don't even know what you're trying to get at with the sound effects as far as confusion or mystery, or a storm is coming, is that a bad thing? For the talk of gulls, it's kind of crazy that we don't see gulls flying around. It's kind of crazy we don't hear gulls flapping their birds' wings. But yeah, I think going heavy on the emotional audio to the point where it's dragging the player by the nose makes sense when you have a 4-hour game at most walking simulator. You can back off on that idea more the longer your game is, but you're fairly constrained by the short length.
Places in the game where you see a lot of strange things, and this is very deliberate. One of the things we wanted to do is just kind of like not spoon feed the player every little piece of story. We kind of just, some things are literally just in there to just kind of let you think and let you decide on whatever you want to bring to the story yourself. So it's kind of like I approached it like an impressionist painting, where you've got like this kind of very vague outline of things, but if you stare at it enough, you can kind of like fill in the spaces, and kind of the image comes together on its own. So a lot of these kind of strange pieces of geography and stuff, that's really kind of deliberate in some ways, just to kind of keep the player's mind open and kind of bring their own interpretations of the story through that.
Yeah. It may be a case, I'm fairly certain this is the urn. It may be a case that the achievements aren't counting it, or it may be a case that I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. I don't have any buttons, so I can't really interact with that anymore. I'm hoping the urn would be in the same place every time. If I did have to play the game a third time, which I may very well have to play the game completely a third time, there's no guarantee here, no heads-up display or anything that points to where you're points to the point where you're actually collecting all of the developers' commentary, so there could be one I missed somewhere. And now, having been through this first chapter a second time, it definitely seems like there's not that much that I did miss, and I very possibly did not miss anything in the second chapter. See, this would have been a point to, in the middle of the load, have a cutscene, have a flashback, have a monologue, something very impactful. If you had at least 3 monologues, well, 4, one at the beginning of the game, one at the beginning of the other 3 chapters, you would then have at least a somewhat consistent narrative with a lot of variables that could change. But yeah, this definitely feels very much like the TV show Lost, in that J.J. Abrams made like the pilot, I think, of Lost, and didn't work on any of the rest of it, and introduced his concept of a mystery box, which basically means we're going to imply there's a mystery and then never really know what the mystery is ourselves, so whatever we reveal will never be built up to in any way, and instead we're going to just make, like the Lost TV show, mysteries on top of mysteries and red herrings on top of mysteries to try and drag out the mystery box and the mystery box concept as much as possible. Dear Esther feels very much like that. We're going to make a randomized game, so there's a mystery just because there's weirdness here. It's almost the equivalent if you walked into a garbage dump and you were just walking through the hills of trash bags and garbage, and you assumed that that random assortment of garbage connected in some way and made a narrative. So it's almost, although I don't think they intentionally did this, a meta commentary on the madness of the main protagonist, in that I, as a player, am playing the game, even the first time I play this game, and trying to make some sense out of what is just random items and madness. But overall, it really is just laziness. And arguably, if you want to make a game, modding another game is probably the wrong way to go these days. I would suggest learning programming in school. Python's a good one to start with, but it's not really that helpful in learning video game programming. Jumping directly into C++ and C# programming from the beginning is probably better. Depends on what your school in early years offers. Better to have some level of programming in some language than no level of education in programming at all. Once you're in late years of high school and college learning programming, then you jump on something like the Godot engine. It's kind of impossible at the moment to recommend the Unity engine, but back in the time that this game was being made, it would have made a lot of sense. Or you learn the Unreal Engine, There are other engines available, but a lot of them are not worth learning. And if you're playing like a specialized engine like RPG Maker that's just so specialized around making RPG Maker looking games and our 8-bit RPG games in general, that's not really a good direction to go either, because nobody likes RPG Maker games. But yeah, starting from that perspective, learning either Godot or Unreal would be my two suggestions at the moment. Will put you down the path of being a real video game programmer versus being a modder versus being a hopeful that really doesn't have the skill set. And the massive amount of struggle you'll have learning Unreal Engine or the Godot engine will set you up for either success or failure to have the skill to actually make a real game. Mods make things a little too easy, which makes creators and artistic people a little too lazy. It's a concept that will be expanded as the years go further, with things like artificial intelligence generating images and code and dialogue. Things are just going to get easier and easier if you take the easy path, to the point where nothing that gets created will actually be as artistically creative or good, because it will just be regurgitated copy and paste content that we've either seen before or that isn't that good to begin with. Anyways, I don't want to go into a big rant. It looks like in this developer's commentary we're going to end up spending another 4 hours going through Dear Esther, which is a lot of commitment, really. Anyways, that's going to be it for this recording. As always, I ask you to like, share, subscribe, comment, and watch every second of my videos. If you want to support me further, there's a link down below in the description box. Thank you for watching. Have a good evening.